This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
There are now more than 8 billion people in the world, the United Nations says in a new report. And as the global population has grown, around 70% of the added population is in low and lower middle-income countries. The report attributes this unprecedented growth to an increase in human lifespan owing to improvement in public health. But experts warn a growing population piles on the challenges already facing the world. So what are the pros and cons of this global population milestone? And what specifically does it mean for Africa? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, in 1927, the world's population was estimated to be 2 billion people, and in just over a century, this has grown by 400%. The latest projections by the United Nations suggest that the global population could grow to around 8.5 billion in 2030, 9.7 billion in 2050, and 10.4 billion during the 2080s. Now, while the global population reaches new highs, the growth has been uneven across countries. Declining birth rates in some populous nations have caused alarm, while rising growth rates in poorer nations threaten to strain systems that are already struggling. As the report says, the 46 least developed countries are among the world's fastest growing, and countries of sub-Saharan Africa are expected to contribute more than half of the global population increase anticipated through 2050. However, the increased population provides the opportunity for accelerated economic growth per capita, known as the demographic dividend. So to maximize on this, countries should invest in their human capital by ensuring access to healthcare, quality education, and by promoting opportunities for productive employment. And joining me now to take a closer look at the world beyond 8 billion people are from Cape Town, Professor Nancy Stigler, Head of the Statistics and Population Studies Department, University of the Western Cape. From Lagos, Honorable Barrister Bimbola Asalu-Hundeyin, Federal Commissioner, Board of the National Population Commission of Nigeria. And from Nairobi, Professor Alfred Omenya, Specialist in Green Architecture and Sustainable Urbanism and CEO of EcoBuild Africa. Welcome everyone to the program. Bimbola, let me start off with you because it took all of human history until 1803 to reach the first billion in population. The next billion took 124 years and the next 33 years. But more recent billions have come every dozen years or so. So what has led to such exponential growth in the last 100 years?
I absolutely agree with you that currently the population growth has been very alarming. But obviously, the reasons are not far-fetched. One, the educational quality in the world has become better. People are more exposed and they can take care of themselves better. People live better living. You have better agricultural produce. You have better healthcare facilities. So people live longer and then reproduction is easier than before. So mortality rate is not as high as it used to be then. Just like you did say, it took over a century for us to move, for the world to move from 1 billion to 2 billion. But recently, it was just 11 years that we moved from another one to increase by another 1 billion.
Right.
So it is all these things, modernity, technology, health facilities have brought these changes faster and quicker. And that's why we have more people on the surface of the earth.
Professor Stigler, we're hearing that it's the longer lifespan. Modernity has enabled people to live longer, but more than half of the projected increase in global population up to 2050 will be concentrated in just 8 countries, most of them the poorer countries, the DRC, Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, India, Pakistan, and the Philippines. 5 of these are in Africa. Why is this the case?
the first issue is a structural one. These countries are already very populated countries. So obviously the crude number of people, the more they're going to reproduce themselves, the faster it's going to go. So the first issue is a matter really of structure, because the basis is already a large base. The second issue is that those countries we can consider that they are still in development. So among these countries, many of them are still living on agriculture, on small manual businesses. So in such cases, children are still seen as a workforce. They are still seen as helping parents, and they are also considered as a support when their parents are getting older. Right. So it's a type of old age pension system, if you will. So all this makes that children are still a value. It is a socio-economic value, and there is also tradition, culture that really values children as a wealth by themselves.
Professor Stigler, but when you look at these countries, though, many of them are also undergoing rapid urbanization, moving from the agricultural setups to the more urban areas. I mean, even when you look at this large number of population that is growing, what does this mean for Africa's economic and social outlook?
Well, this is beyond a demographic, a purely demographic question. The problem then becomes a balance between urban and rural, and we are talking about really urban planning. So this is what is actually happening, and this is quite dangerous, is that we have the usually young population that is not always educated, that are moving towards the center, the economic centers, and they do not always find job. And this is a problem in Africa, where we could have a chance with this young population that is in the working age. Right. This is what we call the demographic dividend, actually, and they could be used as a working force. The problem is that when this young population is not employed, then we do not harness the benefit of that demographic dividend. So to be able to occupy these young people and to have them being an engine, really an economic and demographic engine for a country, we need to make sure that they are educated, that the labor market is sane and flourishing, that they can be employed, that the private and public infrastructure are in a good place, and that also the health sector is actually adequate.
Professor Omenya, given the unfolding UN projections, where we're seeing the world now having surpassed the 8 billion mark, it seems the efforts to stem population growth have failed. Why is this?
I don't think the efforts to stem population growth has failed. I think the issue is where are these particular populations, growing? Of course, Africa is still relatively high, but if you look, if you disperse this regionally, you'll find that we have parts of the world where the population is diminishing. For example, in Europe, the populations are either stable or getting lower. The number of older people are a lot higher. The global population is not actually growing uniformly. We know that the big growth that has pushed us to this number is coming from Asia, bits of Latin America, a little bit of Africa, and China, of course, liberalizing. Again, the two patterns there, you see that in India and China, because their absolute population is very big, so even small percentage growths, has significant impact on the global population. In Africa, and to some degree Latin America, it is the rate which is high, but of course the numbers are also becoming significant. I think Africans are also in that line of 1 billion. So if you look at Europe, of course, the populations are diminishing. If you look at countries like Japan, the population are diminishing. Yeah, so basically what you're looking at here is a global figure, but if you are to spread this regionally, you'll see that there are very, very different growth patterns in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in China, and so on and so forth.
Bimbola, I want to look at where the declining rate is, because according to the UN report, though, the world population rate declined from around 2% per year 50 years ago to under 1% per year today. What parts of the world are witnessing a declining population, and why?
The parts witnessing the declining population obviously are the developed countries. Because, like we all have said here, health facilities over there are actually better. For example, let's take China. China had a government policy that said not more than one child. That had helped their population to. And in the least developed countries, or the developing countries, as we say, population is not declining. It's rather on the increase because, one, cultural belief. Two, some are also religious. Three is also because people believe that children are a source of joy and should not be tamed. What I mean by tamed, not in terms of morals, but in terms of you don't decide what you have, that they are God's gifts from heaven. So you should have as many as you will. And like Prof said, they use them in the farms. People believe that the larger your family is also in some parts of the developing countries, the large families are seen as a thing of affluence. That, oh, we're this big and all that. So the population is growing higher. For example, in my country, Nigeria, it is growing higher, especially in certain parts of the country, like in the northern part, than in the southern part.
I want to rope in Professor Stigler, because one of the issues that is coming up, Professor, here is that the role of policies, government policies in stemming the growth of population. And, many African countries and many developing countries did put in place policies of, birth control in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. But we're still seeing the population in these countries rising. So do these policies work at all?
Well, I think we always see this as a matter of family planning and contraception, but this is far from being the only thing that you have to take into account. When a country has managed to reduce fertility as a choice, and they have given the choice to the women, to the couple to do so, they did not only rely on those family planning policies and programs. They first use the education as the first factor. If you educate your girls, they are going to remain at school longer. Therefore, the age at first marriage is going to be pushed. And mathematically, the time that you can get pregnant is going to be reduced. So this is the first thing. Increase of education of girls and boys, but mainly girls, it's extremely important. The second thing in place was that they indeed explained the benefit of reducing a family, and then the modernism, comfort also, and with developing the economy also played a role, whereby people could see that when you divide wealth by 3 or 4 rather than 6 or 7, you tend to live a, let's say, a better material life. So this is also how basically it works. So pushing the age at first marriage, pushing the age at first pregnancy, and then the family planning and contraception policies and programs could really work. And it worked in some countries indeed. It was accepted in Asian countries. Right. It was accepted in certain African countries. So it really worked in some others, better than in others.
All right. For now, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll look at some measures Africa will have to put in place to cater for the surge in population growth. Do stay with us. Welcome back to the program. Well, still with me are Professor Nancy Stigler, Barrister Bimbola Saluhundeyin, and Professor Alfred Omenya. Before the break, we looked at some of the reasons for the surge in global population in the last century. Let's now look at some measures that will have to be put in place to cater for population growth in the decades to come. Professor Omenya, if I may start off with you, because in the late 1960s, Kenya became the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to begin developing a national family planning campaign. First, did it work, and is it still in place?
Yes, I think it actually did work. We saw sizes of families in Kenya, reducing significantly. And it was typical to have families of, say, between six to all the way to 15 people from same father and same mother. So the fertility rate in Kenya has dropped quite considerably. In fact, currently we are talking about just an average of 4 per family. And of course, that is not uniform across the country. We know to the north of the country, the fertility rates still hover between 6 to 10 people per family. Mm-hmm. But we know in cities is a lot lower, it's 2 to 3 children per family. But you'll see that actually Kenya, relative to the East African countries, has relatively lower fertility. And I think a lot of this is linked initially the family planning, but I think now it is more of a socio-economic parameters that is making it impossible for families to be larger. But still the fertility rate is still reasonably high. But of course, compared to countries like Uganda and Tanzania, then of course the fertility rate is just a notch lower,
right?
Based on regional statistics. Yes.
Professor Stigler, we've heard about, the population plateauing probably by 2080, around there, 2100. I mean, if you look at it from Africa's perspective, though, with the rise in population growth, should we worry?
This is a very good question in the sense that when we look at a population or at the population globally, finally, it doesn't mean anything, because globally, yes, okay, 11 billion, 10 billion, but we have to look at how it is distributed geographically and also what is the structure and the distribution by age of the population. And this is where we are going to have a problem, because there's going to be a real imbalance between the north and the south. The north still being richer than the south, where we are going to see a population that is going to get older and older. So that means that soon, and this is what is starting to happen in Japan, this is starting to happen in Korea, where the population is going to decrease. This is one thing, but the population is going to be mainly old people. And at the same time in the south, in Africa, where we can see that some countries are still growing fast. Mm-hmm. I take, Nigeria, but Niger, take Mali, take Egypt, for instance. Those countries are going to produce young people. As we were saying before, those people are forming a potential demographic dividend. And these people at this stage are really struggling to find job. We have an employment of more than 50%, for instance, in South Africa. Mm-hmm. So what is going to happen is that we're going to have the north, where we are going to literally miss people to work and to pay the pension of those who are retired. Mm-hmm. And in the south, we are going to have a huge population that is going to be unemployed, unoccupied, and this is where it becomes quite dangerous.
Right.
And so it's going to be quite an imbalance. How are we going to respond to this imbalance? This is going to be the next challenge. Are we going to go towards migration, international migrations?
Right.
Or are we going to continue to reduce the entry to the different countries? At some point, the question is going to have to be asked in these terms.
Bimbola, interesting question there. That huge population that is about to rise in the south. Of course, many will be wondering, should governments put in place more campaigns or policies, across African countries for contraceptions, for instance? Is that appropriate, or what can be done? Or is there anything really that needs to be done?
What I do know might not work, at least in Nigeria, is what worked in China. Because we had a military head of state one time that pegged children in every family to 4. It never worked for a lot of reasons. It's not easy for you to peg that with an African person. How do you even enforce that? And don't forget, some of them men also marry more than one wife. So if you're saying a family shouldn't have more than 4, and it has 4 wives, or a woman shouldn't have more than 4, are you saying it's a woman that should have 4, or is that the whole family that should have one child? It didn't work. That is that. But there's so many other ways that population can be managed. I'll use the word, because control is difficult. You don't go into people's bedrooms and tell them what to do. You can't determine that. One, if we educate the girl child, she understands what she wants. It's very important. Then there is a long time for her to start childbearing. 2, we must encourage the use of contraceptives. It's very important. And I think our men too, they should begin to have an attitudinal change towards children. Why the developed countries don't have so many, a lot of them just have 1 or 2 children. Although now to them too, it's a disadvantage, because if people talk of population explosion in Africa, they can have population extinction out there because they have a lot of old people. But if we have our children pegged through education, through attitude, through religious beliefs that are helpful to development, then we are properly educated in proper areas that bring better life. This will give us employment. If the government will provide employment, private sector, there are good investments, we have good infrastructure, there is peace in African countries because of the youth bulge.
All right, I want to get your winding up comments and your final thoughts here. And Bimbola, let me start off with you, because we've heard that as a result of the life expectancy growing and getting better as a result of modernity, the population is going to keep growing. In winding up, though, what do you foresee as the future?
Well, I see a future if, and I use the word if, the government approaches population with a more determined attitude to give the people a better life. You cannot have a country without a population. Governments are in place so that they can give better lives to the people. And the people constitute the population. So the government must be determined to give this better life. And therefore, they must come up with policies. Some will be persuasive, some will probably be enforced policies, but the most policies that will affect the economy, the social status of the people, the infrastructure, the health, the education, and education is key in this. When people are educated and you explain to them the essence of what you're doing, even if they are going to have some little pains, they will understand and move along with you to achieve better lives for themselves. I see a future because we have, youth represents energy, and Africa has a lot of youth, particularly Nigeria has youth. If our youth can be put to better use, advantageous youth, they will be able to bring in much more to Africa. And when we are all old, they'll be able to look after Africa and then proceed with a bright Africa.
All right. Professor Stigler, what does it mean for the future, this population rise?
Well, something that we didn't speak about yet, and that is a problem, is that it's going to be the big footprint on the population, on the environment. We can see that it is starting. It is probably continue to grow, and it is going to grow with the population and with modernism, as it's very hard to go backwards. So this is one of the main problem. The second one is going, and it's linked actually, is going to be the problem of balance. So I foresee that we are going to have huge movement of population, that we start seeing economic refugees and we see more and more people from Africa trying to join Europe, for instance, but also climatic refugees. And this is the case in particular in the Pacific, where we are going to soon have climatic refugees from those small islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Samoa, for instance. So we are probably going to have to be prepared to see big movements of population, and probably a mix of population between young people coming from developing countries and basically coming to be the new economic engine of the old continent.
All right. Professor Menya, I want to get your final comment here, because, you know, the growing population is also putting pressure on natural resources and social amenities. What are some measures that can relieve this strain?
Beatrice, of course, you know me from another perspective. I am a preacher of sustainability. I'm a believer in efficiencies of systems, that we create for ourselves. I'm a believer in cities. And I think I said on this particular program that cities occupy less than 2% of the global population. So that 8 billion you're talking about, majority of it lives in cities. I think over 6 billion actually live in cities. What you must do urgently, this particular demographic you're talking about is spread, is like they're broadcasted over the rural landscapes, basically making productions of our natural systems very, very low, making our land uses very inefficient, starting to compete with, say, areas that have been conserved, for nature, for wildlife, and so on, eating into agricultural land as, inefficient human settlement patterns are in place. It makes it very difficult to provide for them services. I think it is very, very urgent that African countries focus almost immediately on development of urban settlements, those are the cities and towns, but more importantly on rural settlements. We must actually plan rural settlements. We cannot afford to continue using our rural land the way we do. We must have a small footprint on the rural agricultural land. We must have a small footprint on our rural ecosystem. And the way to do it is to ensure that we create concentration of people within rural areas, in planned areas, where we can provide them with all the basic services like water, electricity, and so on, where we can provide them with infrastructures, roads, and so on, where we can provide them with the social amenities, schools, hospitals, and so on in concentration places. Because when people are spread all over the landscape haphazardly, it becomes very, very inefficient to provide them with resources. It also becomes extremely expensive to provide them with resources. Of course, some of them end up in unplanned urban and rural slums.
All right. Thank you also very much for that insightful discussion. But that's all for this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests. Professor Nancy Stigler, Head of the Statistics and Population Studies Department, University of the Western Cape. Barrister Bimbola Saluhundeyin, a Federal Commissioner Board of the National Population Commission of Nigeria. And Professor Alfredo Menya, Specialist in Green Architecture and Sustainable Urbanism and CEO of EcoBuild Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, bye-bye.